Okay, for people joining us, we are continuing right on the tail of another meeting. We are going into our language completeness and consistency meeting, looking at various Wolfram language features. Looks like a famous last words. It looks like a comparatively short agenda today. Okay, let's.
And you want to be running in a recent prototype build if you want to evaluate things.
Okay. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, should I bring up this notebook in the prototype build?
I don't think you have to.
Okay. Okay, ValidArgumentsQ. The heck is this doing? What is it doing? What does it do?
So these are things you approved, although apparently you've forgotten. Are argument checking functions, and there's a futurized ref page, although I'm discovering that it's hard to sort of write the documentation, and I sort of explain why. But there, in that notebook, and also in separate arguments, has sort of
So this doesn't evaluate its arguments?
No.
This is highly relevant to Christopher's project. So what is the use for
in applications? There are examples of returning unevaluated.
Right. You went right by them. Yeah, there.
So wait a minute. So this is a thing. It doesn't evaluate its arguments. It's essentially doing meta-programming, looking structurally at that object.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing whether...
Right.
We have always had some internal functions that we use to check whether the number of arguments is correct in input. Mm-hmm. And so this is the idea of promoting those functions to system.
And this also checks option names for functions that have options.
Okay, what's separate arguments?
It returns a list or possibly another head where it returns a list of the positional arguments followed by a list of the options flattened. So it's somewhat less useful, but there are styles of programming that for which this is useful, so it's included. And sort of underneath, they're basically the same function, right? One basically just returns the arguments, and the other just turns that into a predicate.
So how would this work in the confirm and close world of checking?
Well, this is slightly orthogonal.
No, I mean, I think the thing that I'm confused by is you would end up with something which says confirm test of expa, valid arguments Q of expa, or whatever it is, f of xyz.
Hello, by the way.
Oh, great. Okay, we're talking about a function called ValidArgumentsQ, which is a standardization of argument checking that takes an unevaluated function and checks whether its argument structure is correct.
Okay, so it's like, okay, yeah, I mean, there's like a kernel function that basically does this.
Right. So then the idea would be that in the confirm enclosed world, you would have things like this all over the place. Is that right?
Possibly. I mean, depends on whether you want to return a failure object or if you want to just issue a message and return unevaluated.
Right. Like, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, the most common case for this is probably going to be, I mean, okay, for example, the case where this is used in kernel code, the usual behavior is issue an automatic message where it'll automatically say such and such called with n arguments, n arguments are expected, right? And then it returns unevaluated. So
this returns a message by default. This is a message returning function. This is a function that
Right.
Very odd for a Q function to be a message returning function, but this is.
It doesn't return a message. It issues a message to the side effect.
I mean, maybe this is kind of analogous to like what assert does, where it prints a message.
Right.
So I mean, maybe I don't know. Maybe Q is not the right name, but I don't know.
It's still a Q function because it
returns true or false.
It has the convenient, I claim, and obviously most of us claim, side effect of issuing the message that you want the function to issue, because it's the way of centralizing argument checking so that people don't have to invent that themselves.
Okay, so what would the typical piece of code look like?
Right.
Would it be, I mean, would the typical piece of code say f of x blank y blank colon equals blah, 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 slash semi, valid arguments q, f of x, y? It's kind of grotesque that you have to repeat the f of x, y. And the alternative, I suppose, would be to say, e colon f of x, y blank, valid arguments of e, which, would that work?
That works. I've started doing that. I use
that pattern also
in the kernel.
Yeah. Right. And that, I mean, the more common use case actually is f of xy equals blah, and then f of, null blank sequence equals valid arguments q.
What about this? Would this work?
Sure.
No, because I think the precedence for question mark.
Well, yeah, I mean, assuming you put in the
work.
Parentheses, but yes, that would work.
So that somewhat bizarrely, it would look like. Would it look like this?
No. You need.
Stop after the Q.
Yeah.
What?
And I don't think you want x comma y now. I think you want args triple underscore.
No,
well, you want
because if you already know that it's got two arguments.
Right. I mean, right. It'll need to be a pure function, right? Because you'll need to, right. So.
I see what you're saying. Well, we could have a curried in an operator form of this, valid arguments q of 3.
But see, even that you need parentheses. The precedence for question mark is higher than brackets.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, that's not that grotesque. I mean, that's a slightly weird. You need the parentheses, but although we could have the code assistance system warn you, that to me is not in a grotesque piece of code.
Right, except I don't think that'll actually work, right? Because this needs to hold its arguments, right? This function is hold first, right? So unless you,
right, this is just going to infinitely recurse.
Great. Okay, so only the pattern slash semi. So, but this would work.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because
if you specify the argument count.
Yeah.
Because the L value mechanism knows that colon isn't to be included in the L value. Right? It knows that.
Right. Yes. It's because optional. It's because pattern has higher precedence than set. Right.
Yes, I understand that, but it isn't setting a pattern on patterns. I mean, sorry, it isn't setting an assignment for pattern. It's setting an assignment for F still.
Yeah, that's a common thing, though. Like, this is not a super unusual structure. I mean, especially for subvalues. Like, this is very useful when if you have like a data type or something, and then you want to define lots of subvalues for it. And then really often you want to be able to say, whatever your object is, d colon that object of such and such. And then that way you can say d of and then give it another sub-value. So you could write sub-values in terms of other sub-values.
Okay. I mean, and this is the up values mechanism, which was different. So that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So go ahead.
So maybe another use of this is, sometimes people write you write all of your patterns for the different usages, and then you write like a catch-all pattern at the end, where you say, f of expert triple underscore. And then, one lazy thing that you can do is, you throw a message that just says, oh, the arguments are not the right structure, but that's kind of bad because it's not very specific. So another usage of this might be in that catch-all case where you would just write, ValidArgumentsQ of, E, semicolon, then maybe do some other tests. And then if all of those fail and they don't return a message, then you can give a final kind of, general message. I don't know. That might be another use case.
Well, but what do you set this equal to? I mean, is it equal to null / this?
Well,
yeah, or whatever, right? The value doesn't matter, right? Because you're going to have a parentheses and a semicolon false there.
Right.
This is assuming you want to return unevaluated, right? If you want it to, if you want to return a failure object or something,
yeah,
I see.
You'd have to do something else.
And it's assuming you actually covered all the other cases.
Well, yeah, you'd absolutely need like a catch-all case at the end. So you'd say valid argument Q of whatever, and whatever other tests you have, and then you'd say and message, the general message, semicolon false, right, or something like that.
Yeah,
it's a little weird.
Right. Yeah. So some people do that too. Yeah. Right. So they open parentheses. Right. And either you do semicolon. Well, you can do semicolon false and close parentheses at the end of the valid arguments queue. Right. And so this is, okay, you didn't match any of my main patterns, so I'm going to issue a message about invalid arguments here. That's a common idiom. And then if there are other ways you might possibly fail, then you might have, ands after the valid arguments queue to issue other messages. If there are cases where you can return unevaluated for other reasons.
I see. It's a little bit not perfect, but this is better than what people are doing right now.
Yes. Right. So if you open up the separate arguments, which I admit is the less useful, but I have sort of discussion in there about why it's so hard to write good documentation for this. Is it not? Oh,
no,
okay.
I just said the wrong thing.
There we go. Right.
Weird.
Right. So we have, and actually I also mentioned this in the agenda, that we have sort of 4 different things. We have sort of all arguments, which is everything. We have options, which are the rule-like things that go into option value.
Personally, I would recommend saying argument rules of the expression and return an association that says positional, I don't know, arrow, blah, blah, blah.
Maybe you want also colon greater than, because maybe the function is, hold all or something like that.
Right.
Here.
Yeah.
And even with the rule delayed, it's going to be.
Yeah, I mean, you probably still need the optional head. There's an optional. There's an option where you can change the head to a list of. No. It's not head. So there's an option to the function that changes. If you look at head there, that changes the wrapper from list, so you can make it hold. So you can ensure.
Well, but so in that case, though, if you set that to hold, so it doesn't return a list of holds, it returns just a big hold, right?
Correct.
Okay. I mean, it seems like the only things you really ever want to use are hold and hold complete, right? I mean, otherwise, it's
Right.
kind of just like
Well, I
flaw.
mean, there are. I mean, I can conceive of cases where it might be handy because you have your own custom holding construct in your body of code that might be useful. But as a general rule, yes, hold and hold complete are the natural other values than list for
Right.
for this.
Yeah,
option.
I guess, yeah, you're right. I mean, there's also even stuff like inactivate that you might use. Or actually, no, inactivate I don't think is fair args, but yeah.
Exactly. Because
I think in cases where I've used the non-system version of this, I frequently use as my head, sort of a function that is, has the appropriate hold attributes that is then going to, sort of immediately proceed to do things. So I sort of cut out a middle step in the process.
I see. So that's an application to this. Okay, so I mean, but one approach here would be to have an argument rules thing where the second argument to argument rules could be a string name which extracts just that particular feature, or you could get the whole association and then extract from it.
Well, I mean, you still need. Well, I guess we could have that optional. I guess it would be an optional third or fourth argument, right? Because we still need the other arguments there, right? We can't, right? There's no such thing as positional and optional if you don't say how many positional arguments there can be, right? So at a minimum, you need 2 arguments, and I believe the current separate arguments takes 2 or 3.
Okay, well, then we could also have an association there that has more information about this function. It would be nice, wouldn't it, to be able to share that block of information between argument rules and a syntax colorer and things like this.
Possibly.
What is the story currently with the syntax colorer? And how does that relate to ValidArgumentsQ?
Well, certainly ValidArgumentsQ checks way more things than the syntax colorer can check. For one thing, it can check for hidden options. Okay,
fine, but if I'm trying to set up a function and I want 2 things, I want the valid argument message and I want the and I want syntax coloring. How do I achieve that?
I'm sorry, I was having a little coughing fit, and so I didn't actually hear your question.
Okay, so I'm saying if I want to achieve 2 things, I'm defining a user-defined function. I want it to syntax color, and I want it to have valid argument messages. How do I achieve that?
Well, you create the aptly named not yet existing function that would set the syntax information and I guess set up a default rule that issues messages for any
okay. So what's setting
cases.
all of this stuff? I mean, is there another thing where we say something like set? I mean, is there yet another function here? Something like set valid arguments of f, comma, blah, blah, blah.
There's not. Well,
yeah. Go ahead. Could we do that? Should we do
that? Right. Right. I mean, so we could do that, I think, and it would. Right. I mean, it would. The only limitation would be is that, well, if there aren't options, basically the user would have to write sort of Right, there wouldn't be any. So the basic issue is, suppose we did this and we set up the default rule that issued that message. There would be the user, if they had any cases that didn't match but were still correct options, they would have to somehow issue those messages themselves. Valid patterns, I mean. Right, so suppose not every two arguments, suppose you said set valid arguments of f to 2, but then if you just wrote f of x, y equals stuff, and that always evaluated, then that's fantastic. But if there's a case where that didn't evaluate, then you would just fall down and you would never issue a message because you did have the correct number of arguments, which maybe is fine. Maybe we don't care about that case, but.
Okay, hold on. What is the story with the syntax coloring stuff? Set syntax information or whatever it's called.
Yep.
It's syntax information, but yeah. So I mean, that's, by the way, another model. So there's maybe two versions of this, which is, one version is you sort of do something like what we were doing before, where you sort of just give it some sort of kind of arbitrary pure function or something like that, and it runs those and it does those tests and so on. And maybe you want to make some functions like this ValidArgumentsQ that sort of are the functions that you would give it. The other version is something more like syntax information, which is more rigid, but maybe also a bit easier to use, which is where you just sort of give it, a list of rules or an association or something that just gives it, you have a set number of keys where you just say number of arguments or, options or whatever. And then it sort of works from there.
Okay, so hold on a second. So this, I don't quite understand why syntax information is, what does this do? Why? So this syntax information, if I say arguments pattern 2 to 5 and I give 7 arguments, it will have nothing to do with the evaluation. It will not force it to return unevaluated when it's an out of range number of arguments. Is that true?
Correct.
But typically the patterns will just, so I see. So the generation of a message for that case, one could imagine could be included in syntax information. That, for example, one could say, among these properties, one could say, arguments message arrow true.
Right. I mean, the only thing is you don't necessarily want that because, for example, well, maybe this is a different problem, but there are some functions that, that might have an undocumented third argument, for example.
Or right. And the other problem, right, is, if functions already do their own checking, if this is adding a random down value to accomplish this, then that's a problem.
And how does rules mode get incorporated into this?
How does what?
Rules mode?
Well, rules mode isn't really relevant to...
What is it?
It's one of the options of ValidArgumentsQ and separate arguments about how to treat lists of rules and lists of rules and lists thereof. Because if you don't have a fixed number of arguments and you have rules in those optional argument positions, you may not know whether those are to be treated as positional arguments or as options.
Does syntax information allow an arbitrary pattern here? If I say
no, it is precisely those patterns that are documented in the notes there. Otherwise, the front end will assert and sadness will ensue.
Okay, but we could also then have another optional way to set this, which is just something about argument count. Doesn't really make any difference. I don't understand. We are multi-counting here. I mean, by having this ValidArgumentsQ as well as syntax information, it seems like we're doing the same thing twice.
Perhaps the idea would be that if you don't specify the second argument of ValidArgumentsQ, it comes here and see what are the valid number of arguments.
Well, that's interesting. So you're saying ValidArgumentsQ. See, but to me,
right, but ValidArgumentsQ checks way more than syntax information ever could.
Sure, I'm just trying to connect both functions.
Right. But I'm saying that I don't think, but I'm saying it's not an either or, which is what Stephen was trying to argue.
Well,
right?
I mean, it was okay. I get it, but there are three things that go on. Okay, there's syntax coloring, there's actual argument enforcement, and there's generating a message. By argument enforcement, I mean forcing even in a triple blank situation, forcing an unevaluated return. Okay, those are three separate and somewhat orthogonal things, I think. And I like Jose's idea of using syntax information as the sort of automatic setting for ValidArgumentsQ. That seems sensible to me. Whether ValidArgumentsQ needs to generating a message from ValidArgumentsQ seems kind of weird to me.
I mean, I have
the function though. I mean, otherwise it's just length, right? The whole point of it is it's
well, it's more. It's a lot more than just length, right? Because it checks option names and etc. Sure. But yes, I agree that the default should be to issue messages. Now, if you want to argue that there's a mode where it doesn't issue messages, maybe, but you could just as equally quiet it if you wanted that mode for some reason.
But
how many arg count messages are there?
What's that?
I said, how many arg count messages are there?
At least 8, possibly more.
Right. That's one of the most useful things in this function, that it chooses the right argument message for you.
Okay, there's argx, argt, argtu.
Okay. But what about putting something into syntax information which says, if it's wrong, generate a message on evaluation, or you say basically syntax information shouldn't mess with the evaluation semantics.
Syntax of information isn't. I mean, what syntax information stores isn't used at evaluation time.
That's what I was wondering. I had never heard of syntax information, and just looking at the documentation, I expect it to be for the front end. I don't expect it to be used by the kernel.
Well, based on documentation, you're correct.
I mean, I think it's also that the name syntax information tells you this has nothing to do with actual evaluation.
Right. And by the way, is somebody doing this for the function repository? Are they setting syntax information for those functions?
I think so, because the way system functions get their syntax information is that there's a pass through the documentation notebooks that translates those usage messages into syntax information.
Okay, I don't think it's happening for the function repository right now, and it really should. So good.
I wonder if the fact that it's a compound head and not just a symbol is maybe.
I think it needs to be part of user assistance. So, Devin, could you take that to those guys?
Yes.
And ask what's going on. And I haven't seen that on the user assistance agenda. We should live stream some user assistance meetings. They're kind of interesting.
I mean, at some level, though, I mean, this is sort of general, but it seems like maybe we just need some sort of more general function for sort of declaring when you want to make like a proper function, in the sense, like if you're writing a package, right, and you have lots of little internal functions that are basically just, colon equals, etc. But then sometimes you also are like writing quotes a proper function that's going to be exported, where you want usage lines, you want syntax information, you want proper, messages and stuff like that.
Options.
You want attributes. Yeah, exactly. And you basically just want to set all of these things, because right now you have to, write many different lines to do each of these.
Right. And Stephen, you may not recall, because the meeting where we last discussed this was certainly over a year ago, but basically you approved these two functions as separate steps to be part of the super function that Christopher is describing. So we talked about having a super function but also having these more, because certainly we use, so separate arguments is basically a cleaned up version of system private arguments and system private arguments with rules, which, we've been using internally for a decade, and lots of people use them. So they're certainly useful functions.
Right.
I think, like I said, where and if you want to add the automatic behavior looking at syntax information, I don't have a problem with that actually.
Okay. All right,
but the where we're falling down is writing the documentation, and I mentioned this in the agenda there, that we have these 4 things, like all of the parts. We have options. We have arguments, which are the things which are not options, and then sort of optional arguments, and which
this is for separate arguments, which I don't like the name of. I mean, what's wrong with my argument rules suggestion?
I think we can do that. It's just a minor refactoring. The problem, like I said, and that's fine. I'm happy to rename it that. But the problem is how do we talk about these 4 things in a non-confusing manner?
What are we talking about them for?
Well, for one thing, just read the first usage message. And then there are places in examples or for, describing what rules mode does.
Okay. What's wrong with that first thing? Separates,
okay, well, right. So
generates argument rules, generates a list of rules describing the argument's args.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I was just about to mention, rules seems to suggest a list of rules, not an association.
I know. But we've had that, unfortunately, we've been using this term rules.
Well, most of the rules functions are older functions that actually do use lists of rules. Maybe you use the word information, argument information.
Yeah, well, the problem with that is syntax information sounds more advisory and less. Well, I guess it is advisory. Well, it suggests more like meta information about the arguments.
Okay, yeah, and our argument information is actually, you'd expect that to be the analogous thing to syntax information. You say argument information of f equals, and then you give it some.
Right.
Right. And if you want to understand the purpose, you can again go to the applications area. I wouldn't say this is an idiom that people use, so we're supporting it, but I'm not sure it's the most important.
Which one?
Do we not have one of these? I thought we did. Right, but basically,
were you assigned to the arguments and the options separately?
Right. So I guess this is right. So we separated into the args and options, and then we sort of do a switch on the length of arg lists to sort of, or sometimes they have separate down values for.
It's horrible. Why aren't people using options pattern?
They are using options pattern, but you still
because
need
that
to know.
Doesn't work in exactly the case of the last of a vararg function being a rule, because then it gets included as an invalid as the first invalid option instead of being included in the arguments.
I thought the options pattern looked at the option names.
Nope.
Perhaps it should.
Well, I think if it sees. Well, I think the point is that it's looking at the last argument and it's saying this is not a valid option. But maybe if it's just right, but because it has to, like, if I just gave a single, it kind of has to do that, because otherwise, if I just have plot and I give some broken option as the first, well, I guess plot isn't vararg, so it knows, but yeah.
Right. The canonical example of this for which the arguments with rules variant that has become an option on ValidArgumentsQ was string trim, I think. String split, because the second argument is optional and can be not just a string expression, but a replacement rule. And then people ran into the problem that,
gosh.
Yep.
You just have to really hope it doesn't have any options with like stringified names.
That's right. That's one of the things. And how does it choose whether you meant to specify an option or whether you meant to specify a replacement?
I'm sorry, coming back to options pattern. Does options pattern check the left-hand side of potential options against the list of options for that head?
It can't do that, because if it did that and therefore failed to match, then you wouldn't enter the down value to issue the message that an invalid option was supplied.
I was going to say, it depends on how you call options value or options pattern.
Well, no. It does not depend, because you can specify a function to consult for its options in option pattern, but that doesn't affect which options are matched. That affects how they are, what default values they get.
Okay. And also that's how option value issues the message that there was an invalid option in the list of option Q things that matched options pattern.
Okay, I have a suggestion. What if, maybe this is crazy, what if there was something in patterns that was a wrapper that says, if this doesn't match, generate a message? In other words, you're trying to match something. So I could say, mismatch message of y blank z blank. Okay, so that pattern then becomes, what the heck is that? Why is there?
Because of the syntax.
Because you declared syntax information.
But I got rid of it. I said syntax information of f equals blank. How do I get rid of it?
I don't think you can.
What do you mean? What do you mean you don't think I can?
Because I don't think there's a way to signal to the front end.
Try setting it to an empty list.
Quack. This has got to work. I mean, that's completely crazy.
To try making it try again. I mean, no, you got to give it a chance to write the bracket again. It's only going to check the syntax when you're typing, I think. No.
Blame John Foltz, right? we have. I cannot control what the front end colors or not.
Okay.
Try clear all of F just as a test.
I did. I just tried that.
Why is it black? Try remove of F.
Okay, try arguments pattern goes to empty list.
I did. Arguments pattern here. No,
right.
That's just a hackalola.
We know that then it'll expect
I think that would expect zero rules.
Okay,
then.
guys.
Okay.
Separate problem. Let's figure out how and document how you remove syntax information. It's completely.
Well, it seems like equals dot should remove it, but it looks like it's probably a bug.
Right.
I mean, if you try running syntax information of F, does it return? What does it return? It should return.
Right. Right. And if you clear it. If you unset it, presumably it might still return an empty list. What happens if you?
Oh, but
I
the problem is
Okay, this is a bug.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's just, report it to the front end team and get it fixed. Okay. What I'm suggesting though, is that in the pattern matcher, that there be a mechanism to issue a message if something doesn't match. In other words, try the match, and it will be like saying /semi. So there's probably some way to do it with question mark that would issue a message if it doesn't match. But what about having a wrapper that says that? So in other words, you would say something like, for the options pattern thing, you would have a wrapper around the options pattern that says, if this, I'm not quite sure that's right, but or you put something into the options pattern that says, if you try to match and it doesn't work, if there is no way to match this.
So first of all, I don't know how implementable it is, but second of all, I think this is actually the wrong my point of view is actually that this is solving the wrong problem. The wrong problem, right? I would rather it not match, and then everything fall through to my, default down value that issues the messages about, wrong arguments and invalid options.
I see. Okay, that's not unreasonable. That's not an unreasonable point of view.
So
also, I'm not sure it's well defined because, options value fails to match because actually there's this other pattern that can, match this, etc. So, I mean, I think, I would prefer something like check arguments rather than a ValidArgumentsQ, which suggests a very clean Q function, not something that's off flapping around and issuing messages and doing all kinds of other things.
Okay.
So, I mean, let's say it was called check arguments. And then the thing, and then what you're asking is, what are the, and then it could either be, I mean, I don't like this term, but decompose arguments is kind of, that for the other one, for separate arguments.
Well, what about describe arguments?
We haven't used describe very much.
Does it need a first part? Could it just be arguments?
Let's not use that.
Okay.
Yeah, I other than, never mind this. I know that's what we call the system private version, but I just don't know. Right, until you read a rough page, arguments just means
nothing.
Means nothing. We could call it arguments association if we want to do that.
Yeah, that's what a lot of things are called arguments rules, but
I think we have some number of things which are foo association, which aren't just things that return that,
should it be arguments association or argument association?
Arguments, okay. I think. It's about the arguments. What is down values association?
Oh, really? So we don't have anything in... So we have association foo for things that operate on associations, but we don't have anything in... Maybe
I think we do is like...
What is
entity association?
It's something it's some internal context thing, right?
It's a general utilities, yeah.
Right, you've loaded general utilities apparently, and it's in.
Okay, all right, okay, fine.
But here's an example. There's entity association, the third argument for entity value.
Right, so that's a string argument, but yes.
Yeah, I think there are a few string arguments like that though, but.
Yeah. So that's what I was thinking of. So yes, but entity association, and we have more of them, even if I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Well, okay. So arguments association. Whew. For some reason, arguments rules just seems more natural, but I don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
I think it seems more natural because it's a sort of a function that might have been a really old function, and that sounds like an old function name.
Right. And frankly, we could make this be a list of rules. I'm not sure that we gain that much by having it be an association, right? There are basically going to be two keys in it, right?
We do gain something by being an association because we can index into it more nicely.
Okay.
I'm thinking if it's always going to be two keys, could it not just be a list?
Which is what it is, and it's called right. So if you don't like separate arguments, we could call it arguments list.
That's not terrible.
The only thing is then you think it's going to be the list of exactly.
Right. That's the problem there. That this is not a list of arguments.
Well, arguments lists plural.
Mm-hmm.
The other possibility would be the rather argument option list, arguments options list. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Singular might be better, but
Argument option, I think that's obscure because I think it suggests that it could be the option of the argument and so on.
Yeah, I think arguments options list is clearer. I'm fine with that name actually. Separate arguments from I think was sort of the least bad name we came up with at the meeting, however many months ago it was.
Right. So arguments
but
options
I
list.
do really like including the word option in the function name to make it clear what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, so arguments options list is probably the winner there. So let's look at what it does. So it generates a list of the arguments and options of the function.
Yep.
It's pretty much the correct thing to say. And what it's provided with is the number of things that should be considered as arguments.
Yep.
The first n things should be considered as arguments. How to treat optional positional arguments. What does that mean?
So
that's the string split.
Right. So look at the option values. The following values of rules mode can be given.
I see. And the default here should presumably be the second one. That is, only if it is a valid option of f should you consider it to be an option.
I think I know why you're saying that, but all kernel functions, unless explicitly coded otherwise, actually default to the other behavior.
As some kind of
right. So that way,
future-proofing or what?
Well, for one thing, issuing right. So if it's right, because that way you give a message about an unknown option rather than it quietly being accepted as a positional argument.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, by the way, I actually have to go, so goodbye.
Bye.
Yeah, so I think it is correct that options is the default.
Okay, I'm also slightly losing concentration because I also have to go soon here.
Right, can we...
Actually, there's a question here from Brian saying we should support an official Visual Studio Code plugin. I believe that is actually in the works.
Okay. Can we perhaps look at just a few examples, make sure we're...
Of what?
Of separate arguments, just make sure we're okay with this wording.
Arguments options list.
Right.
Looks okay to me for that one. I think that could arguably be, that should be a failure object, not a $failed.
I suppose it could be.
We're trying to use that because we've got a lot of richer and richer handling of failure objects.
I was going to say, if it returns a failure object, then, for purposes of returning unevaluated, it's more specific than a generic $failed.
Right, although I guess, but given that we've already issued a message, I'm not sure what we gain by duplicating that information in the failure object.
We don't know because it depends on how computable you need to handle it.
Okay.
The other possibility is to return unevaluated here. Message and unevaluated.
No,
That's
that
too
is
weird. I mean,
well, it cannot do the operation. I mean, failure object is fine.
Yes.
I also prefer a failure object to $failed.
Yeah. Okay. Just a minute. Okay. All right. So try, and then this becomes check arguments.
okay.
All right. Let's see whether we can get ValueQ is one of those incredibly horrifying functions.
Right. And I think basically what we've done is pretty good, and you can run the exam. I've added some futurized notes and examples to the ref page that will evaluate in the prototype build. Right. So I guess they're well, maybe I'll let you read them.
Oh boy. This will be good to ask Christopher about, because he just thought about this in connection with the confirm evaluates Q or confirms changes. This is a can of worms. Let's punt this and ask Christopher, because he just thought about this.
Okay.
And so we need to make sure he's in the next one of these meetings.
Okay. Yeah, and neither one of the next two are at all time. Well, maybe the timing function, but that's not a short discussion, I don't think. Maybe it is.
I thought we needed, this would just be a method option or something.
So at the moment in echo timing, at least it is a method option. So we were thinking that in the same way that there is a distance function, we could have a timing function.
Yeah, I thought we agreed on that last time, didn't we?
Well, there was not with this set of people, but the question is whether, I mean, so echo time, as the first bullet point says right there, echo timing has a method option that can take timing, absolute timing, repeated timing, or an arbitrary function. Now, repeated timing, basically is in the absolute timing family. So maybe calling it repeated timing was maybe, well,
I mean, look, the other question is, if you have a timing function, what I would expect is that a time constraint, arrow 17, timing function, arrow absolute timing, would somehow imply that the time constraint was on absolute time. Look, the fact is, what this reminds me of, and this is an interesting idea for time constraint, okay? Maybe there should be a notion of indicating what kind of a time duration that is. And I think we're going to have that issue in the elaborate astro, Earth slowing down world and so on. In the following sense, that right? So it's like, is it CPU time or is it wall clock time? Is it sidereal time? Is it time relative to UTC or whatever? Is that making any sense? I mean, in other words, there's different notions of what. I mean, CPU time is like timing based on rotations of the Earth.
I think here we have the difference between time and timing. So time has a time system, which is UTC or sidereal time or whatever. Timing is always in seconds.
No, but I'm saying timing is the analog of the computational problem for the physical case is timing is how many times did the Earth rotate? How many cycles of the CPU were gone through? That's CPU time or Earth rotation time, as opposed to absolute inexorable time in the evolution of the universe.
If you believe in such things, which I don't,
things?
but the absolute inexorable time of the universe, right? Only local observers with their light clocks have a notion of time, right?
Well, yes,
of absolute time.
Yes, that's well, there's a cosmological rest frame, but we're going to get way off track here. No, I mean you're correct. That's a, but the difference between, I mean, oh boy, this
Right.
slides back into, I finally have a quantity which is actually it's in the hierarchy that starts with speed of light, then it's this maximum entanglement speed, and then the next and final constant in that sequence is something which is the maximum speed of translating between two different rule systems for the universe, which is in the units of, which basically gives you the underlying absolute processing speed of the universe. And its units, I just wrote a post about this, its units are Wolfram language tokens per second. I mean, it could be Turing machine tokens per second, but it has to have units, just like meters per second. It has to have units of computational specification per second.
Right.
Okay, but this is
just to jump back to this, I think Jose's point, which I agree with, is that timing is a quantity, whereas time is a position on some sort of reference frame.
Well, so absolute time, if we went across a leap second, what would happen to it? Absolute time would be the time difference taking out that leap second. So in other words, my computation might actually have taken a negative amount of absolute time if it spanned a leap second.
So the plan is to introduce a time system option in date object, and it will play the role of datums in Geo in the same way that the calendar plays the role of projections in Geo. So there is this separation.
Right. So not actually knowing how things really work at a hardware or OS level, I would claim that absolute timing is always non-negative, because it's going to be the reading on the CMOS clock or something at the end minus the reading on the CMOS clock at the beginning, irrespective of what.
That's not going to be correct, because the NLTP server, whatever it is, the network time protocol, whatever that's called, will reset. In other words, the mapping to UTC.
Right. So then it might overcount, right? If I suppose if it went backwards, it could potentially be negative.
Aren't there leap seconds? Which way around are the leap seconds? I mean, the Earth is slowing down, so there must be leap seconds. I guess that's because the Earth is not speeding up. There can be leap seconds only. They're only added seconds, right? Not subtracted seconds.
It could It could happen that it speeds up. So it's an average that it's slowing down, but it could happen. It's just that it hasn't happened in the last 50 years yet, but it could happen.
Somebody, okay, this is in those silly whatever they are. If all the 7 billion people on the Earth run in one direction at the same time, it'll have absolutely no effect. No, it's
So in relation to the protocol, so when there is a leap second, different computers do different things. So some of them that day, they kind of spread that second during the whole day. And others, they simply repeat the last second. So 23:59 or 60 happens twice.
Wow. I see. So there's a moment at which synchronization is broken for the computers of the Earth.
Exactly. Yes.
I didn't know that. Okay.
So, in a sense, the problem of what to do with timing will be different from the what to do with time. And I know what to do with time because we will have the tables, or 1 second was added here. So every time we do a computation, we will have to take that into account. But what to do with absolute timing, I don't know, because that will depend on the infrastructure in the computer.
Right. At which point, I think we, maybe the answer is we just live with whatever the OS does. And if somebody's really unlucky, they might get an extra second or lose a second in their absolute.
I can just imagine in some piece of code somewhere, something going incredibly wrong if it goes across a leap second and the absolute time is negative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I bet whether we didn't talk about that as possible issues in the absolute timing stuff, but because we don't have it yet, because we don't have this time datums.
Yes.
I'm reminded of the trading systems that screwed up when the price of oil went negative a few weeks ago.
Oh, I was thinking of the old joke of the programmer who wakes up in the year 9999 and everybody's ecstatic because they see on their resume that they know COBOL. Right, so instead of the year 2000, they have the year 10,000 issue.
Oh, yes. Okay, fair enough. The I didn't know. Didn't COBOL have a 2-digit issue? Does it have a 4-digit issue?
I don't know. I think it's just
now it does.
Was the code rewritten, or is it running in a virtual machine that had its time reset? Who knows? I mean, I think there are mainframes that have been in continuous operation since sometime in the 60s. And I doubt that they had software upgrades.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, anyway, so as you say, it's a slightly more complicated discussion. All right. Let's wrap it up here then.
Okay.
All right. Thanks a lot. Oh, let's see. Tomorrow, what's happening? Why am I being told to remind people about upcoming live streams? Oh. Okay. They're apparently, yeah. There are a couple on Friday, Neural Nets and Science and Technology Q&A. All right. Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. Talk to you all soon.
See ya.